All right, good morning, and welcome to the next session of Understanding LDS History. So glad that you are here today, whether you're here in person or you're watching online. Thank you for being here this morning, and excited about what we have to talk about today. And as always, I just want to begin by saying that I'm going to turn my remote on. I want to begin by saying this morning that even though we talk about a lot of difficult topics in this class and a lot of areas where we may disagree with our LDS friends and our LDS neighbors on really important doctrinal matters, that our intention in doing so and our intention in this class is we want to speak the truth, but we want to speak the truth lovingly and to the best of my ability. I want to do that with gentleness and with respect. And I think it's important. I think about Colossians chapter 4 all the time in our current day and age, that we are such a divided society and such a divided culture on so many things, but that our calling as followers of Jesus is that even when we disagree, we can disagree and speak the truth and be gracious while we do so. And my prayer is that I'm able to pull that off in this class as we walk through the history of the LDS Church together. And we're trying to just stick to the history of this is what actually happened in real time and what we can learn from that. And we've taken quite a journey in the last 10 weeks. We started with the death of Joseph Smith and the whole succession crisis that led to the apostles being placed in charge of the church. And then Brigham Young is such a key figure in all of that. We've spent several weeks now going back and looking at his life. And we're back up, finally, to where we left off a few weeks ago. August 8th, 1844, Brigham and the rest of the apostles who'd been off campaigning for president for Joseph Smith, when Joseph and Hiram were killed, they came rushing back to Nauvoo as fast as they could get there, which led to this conference on August 8th, where Sidney Rigdon, who was vying for control of the church, and Brigham and the apostles on the other side, and a few other candidates. All right, they had a conference where Rigdon got to speak, Brigham got to speak, and a lot of people would say that maybe, and it's great, you can go back and read it online, Brigham's full discourse on that day where he talked for like an hour and a half. And a lot of people would say it's maybe one of the most important messages he ever gave. But at the end of the day, on August 8th, the church voted to give control of the church to the 12 apostles following the death of Joseph Smith. And even though it would be a couple of years before Brigham would get the title of president and there would be a first presidency again, the reality is that he started acting like the president almost immediately. And the apostles may have been technically the ones that were in charge, but as the head of the apostles, it was really Brigham that was leading things. And he, even in that time period, he had Heber Kimball and Willard Richards, who were essentially acting as his first counselors and second counselors, acting like a first presidency. But he immediately took charge. And that same day, August 8th, all right, they voted to confirm the 12, and then he put this series of propositions before the people, and they were all unanimously voted on at that time. And so, like, you can see he immediately took control. Okay, good. You gave it to the 12. Now here's what we're going to ask you to do. And so that day they voted on these measures. Is it the will of this congregation that they be tithed until the temple is finished? This thing is not going to be cheap. So are you guys willing to pay for it so we can finish building it? And they voted that they would. Is it the mind of this congregation to loose the hands of the 12 and enable us to go and preach to all the world? Will you leave the 12 to dictate about the finances of the church? And that's always the big one, right? And they voted. Will you turn financial responsibility and financial decisions of the church, are you going to turn those over to the 12? And they said that they would. And will it be the mind of the people that the 12 teach what will be the duties of the bishops in handling the affairs of the church? So, doctrinally speaking, that's a big one. Are you going to listen to the 12 as we disseminate information to the bishops about the direction that the church is going to take? And from the very beginning, Brigham made it clear that it was his desire to carry out Joseph Smith's vision for the church as much as he could. And even in death, Brigham remained doggedly loyal to Joseph Smith. That included completing building the Nauvoo temple. That included implementing the endowment, which we've talked about in recent weeks. And remember, still at this time, the church as a whole didn't know about the endowment. And very few, right? Just Joseph Smith's inner circle that he had taught that to at this point. And so it would have been very easy to take a different direction. But Brigham said, nope, we are going to carry this out and get this implemented for everybody. That included expanding the practice of plural marriage. Even though at this point in time, that was still largely unknown to many in the church. There was a lot of rumors out there, but the official position was still deny, deny, deny to those on the outside, and even many on the inside who weren't aware. But he was committed to that as well. And we'll see this in Brigham's life, especially in the coming years, to establish a politically autonomous kingdom of God on earth. And I know I've said this several times, but you always have to bear in mind when you're looking at LDS history that it was a millennial movement that taught that the church was the restored Israel. Converts were the true Israelites, and God was going to use the church to usher in the millennium within that generation's lifetime and set up his kingdom on earth. And it was Brigham's vision to establish that separate autonomous kingdom of God on earth. And we'll see that when we get ahead to the Utah years eventually. But as brilliant as he was, and he was brilliant in that he came back and despite all of the controversy, in the matter of a couple days, he had leadership of the church settled and firmly in the hands of the 12. But he made one huge boo-boo in that period of time. And that huge boo-boo was that in all of that busyness and rushing back to Nauvoo, in all the meetings and everything that was going on, Brigham never went and paid his respects to Emma, Joseph Smith's widow. And you can see how that would hurt from her vantage point, that he didn't even come to offer his condolences. Probably part of the reason for that, honestly, is that there was no love lost before Joseph Smith died between Brigham and Emma. She did not care for him, and he did not care for her. So there was already tension there, largely over polygamy and Brigham's support of polygamy. And so there was already tension there. But this just upped the tension that he came back and he took over, and he never even stopped in to offer his condolences. And so the one thing that would come out of this whole period is that he won the support of the majority of the church, and we talked about all the splinter groups and factions that split off earlier. But the majority of the church stuck with Brigham and followed the 12, but he failed to win the support of Emma or any of Joseph Smith's remaining family in doing so. They did try, and even on August 8th, he made another one of the motions he made is Hiram had been the patriarch of the church, and that was a very important position. And they voted that day to put William, Joseph Smith's brother, in as the patriarch, even though they had misgivings about doing so. If you remember what we've talked about William in the past, nobody could get along with him. He was just erratic, and nobody could get along with him. They tried. He'd been on the apostles and off the apostles, but they voted, we'll put him in as the patriarch, trying to make amends with Smith's family in giving him that position. But it wouldn't last very long, because William was William, and he ran off at the mouth, and he eventually made statements to, I believe, the Warsaw newspaper about polygamy and what they were doing, and they didn't want that getting out. And long story short, they ended up excommunicating him within a couple of months, and he eventually joined the Strangite movement. But they at least made the effort. But in all of this, when all of the dust settled and everything was said and done, there wouldn't be any members of Joseph Smith's family that were remaining in the church. A lot of the reasons for the misunderstandings between Emma and Joseph, some of it came from Brigham blamed Emma, at least in part, for Smith's death. And he alluded to this in his speech on August 8th, that Brigham and the apostles were all gone. And when tensions were flaring there in Nauvoo, Hiram and Joseph had went across the Mississippi. They were hiding out in Iowa. And Emma and the leaders that were left in Nauvoo encouraged them to come back and turn themselves into the authorities. And then they were eventually killed while they were in jail. And Brigham's opinion was, if I had been here, that never would have happened. And which is easy to say after the fact, right? We're always really good at armchair quarterback after the fact. But his opinion was, if I'd been here, that never would have happened, and I never would have let him turn himself in. And so he blamed those leaders and Emma in part for Smith's death. There was tension there. They were divided on the issue of succession. Even though Emma was wise enough, she didn't really throw her hat in the ring much. She thought Mark should have been the successor. But she largely stayed out of it. And I think, and this is my opinion, this is me reading between the lines, I think Emma was just done with it at this point. She was never a big vocal person about matters of doctrine or of the church and the direction of the church, any of that after Smith's death. I think it would have been interesting had Smith lived to see what would happen, because she was dead set against polygamy. Despite the fact, the revelation we looked at a few weeks ago, where Smith had the revelation that God said, Emma, you better straighten up or else, she still didn't straighten up with regard to that issue. And Smith was killed, so we don't know, but it would have been interesting to see what would have happened had he lived. But she was so ardently opposed to that she kind of stayed out of things. There were things that you've noticed this, and we see this all the time. You see it in your relationships all the time, that if there's somebody that you have an issue with, one of the first things we do is we doubt their motives on everything. And we just assume their intentions were the worst. And we see that in this period from Brigham and Emma. For instance, the Illinois governor, since Smith was dead, he'd been the lieutenant general, the leader of the Nauvoo Legion. And so after he died and Brigham came to power, the governor appointed him the lieutenant general, the leader of the Nauvoo Legion, their militia. And Brigham thought that meant it would come with the uniform that Smith wore and his sword and his white horse that he rode as the leader of the militia. So he got him. And Emma went, that's not yours. That's not your uniform, right? She just assumed the worst. The same thing on Brigham's side, that Emma had kept some stuff of Hiram's that he thought didn't belong to her. Those kind of things where we just automatically, we assume the worst of each other. But the biggest point of contention between the two was, how do you settle Joseph's estate? And I've always said that the two places where people act uglier in life than anywhere else are weddings and funerals. And a lot of families who really love each other have fallen apart trying to settle mom or dad's estate. And that should have been mine, and dad would have wanted me to have it, and right? We see it happen all the time. The problem with Joseph's estate is so much of what they owned, it was in the church's name, but it was in his name. And because they had set him up as the trustee of the church. And so they had all these properties and all these things that the church had bought with Joseph Smith as the trustee. So it's his name on everything. So who does it really belong to? And legally, it was all very fuzzy. And so trying to sort it out led to a lot of hard feelings. Who took possession of Joseph Smith's papers and all the documents he left behind? Does that belong to the church, or does Emma get it? Did the land in Nauvoo belong to the church, or did it belong to the Smith estate? Because the church had bought 500 acres, most of the land in Nauvoo, for all these immigrants and families and people moving in. But the land, does that belong to Smith? Does it go to Emma, or does it go to the church? Things like the general store, the steamboat that was owned. It's all in Smith's name, but he bought it for the church in his name. So who gets all of that? And so hashing all of that out, there was a lot of hard feelings on both parts. And you can see Emma on her side, she wanted to make sure her family was taken care of. And Brigham on his side wants to make sure the church is protected and taken care of. And at the end of the day, Emma always thought that Brigham and the apostles tried to cheat her out of properties that were rightfully hers. And Brigham believed that Emma had forced them to give her properties that had been paid for by the labor and tithing of the church. And this was all bought with church money, by church offerings. Why should you get it all? So there was a lot of tension there. And Brigham moved forward despite that. Like I said, this was probably the biggest mistake he made in terms of how he handled that. But there was never going to be any love lost between those two. Despite that, Brigham moved ahead quickly with building Nauvoo. And it's interesting, right? Smith and Hiram were dead. But that doesn't mean tensions between Mormons and their non-Mormon neighbors had de-escalated any. And they knew. Brigham knew at some level. He knew they were talking about where are we going to go next before Smith even died. And so Brigham knew they were not going to be able to stay in Nauvoo long term. But despite all of that, he plowed forward with building out Nauvoo. Just within the first few months, he built the 70s Hall, which is the picture on top, and a concert hall, and the Nauvoo House, which is the picture on the bottom, which was kind of a hotel. All the members of the 12 were living in just rough log-hewn homes that they had thrown up when they got to Nauvoo. They built permanent brick homes. And by the end of 1845, so Joseph Smith died in the summer of 1844. By March of 1846, Nauvoo's going to be a ghost town. So about a year and a half. So Brigham takes over in August of 44. By February of 46, they're going to begin the evacuation. And it's not going to be pretty. So it's amazing when you think he pretty much accomplished all of this in just about a year. It's amazing what they did. They built Nauvoo out. Remember we talked about the success of his mission in England. Thousands of immigrants are pouring in to Nauvoo as well. And this principle of gathering we've talked about, to where by the end of 1845, Nauvoo had about 11,000 residents, in addition to all of the people living in the outer parts of the county, in the city, that were farming and doing other things. So it rivaled Chicago as the biggest city in Illinois at the time. And it was a beautiful city. Brigham wrote this letter to Wilford Woodruff, who was back in England in 1844. Brigham said, "Nauvoo, or more properly the city of Joseph, as they were calling it, looks like a paradise. All the lots in the land which have heretofore been vacant and unoccupied were enclosed in the spring and planted with grain and vegetables, which makes it more like a garden of gardens than a city. Many brethren are coming from abroad who seem highly delighted with the place and all of its appendages." So you have this brief period of time where Nauvoo gets built out. It's this beautiful city, it's this growing city, but there's still all of this tension with their neighbors. It's not going to go away. Meanwhile, while it was still being denied publicly, the doctrine of polygamy continued to expand. And at this point, there still hasn't been an official statement from the church to the church members or anything, but in that inner circle, it's still growing. But word gets out, right? And part of the reason for some of the tensions, this happens all the time still today, it just happens faster with the internet and social media, is somebody gets something that's got a nugget of truth about the Mormons being polygamist, which was true. They were practicing polygamy, but they take that nugget of truth, and the people on the outside, right, it gets conflated into something it's not, and they're being accused of doing a lot of things that they weren't because the story gets blown out of proportion for the people on the outside looking in. And it's part of what led to all of this tension. And chief among the promoting polygamy, though, nobody expanded polygamy faster in their own personal family in the years they were in Nauvoo than Brigham. Once he was on board, he was on board. Before Smith died, he'd already married Harriet Cook and Augusta Adams Cobb. These pictures are obviously much later in life, a lot of them, before there were any photographs. But before they would leave Nauvoo, he would take all of these additional wives. He married Clarissa Decker, and the number in parentheses here is how many children he had with each wife. So he married Clarissa Decker, with whom he had 5 kids. He married Clarissa Ross, with whom he went on to have 4 children. He married Margaret Maria Alley and had 2 children with her. He married Emmeline Free, with whom he had 10. Quit whining to me about your 2 and how hard it is. 10! That's just one of his wives. And he married Margaret Pierce, with whom he had 1 child. Also in this same period of time, after Joseph Smith died, Smith was sealed and married to 8 of Joseph Smith's widows. Now, not all of those were conjugal wives. A lot of those were, there's a lot of things involved in that kind of the Old Testament principle, right? If you were married and the man died and he had a brother, the brother would marry the wife in order to take care of her. And so there was some of that Brigham married these wives of Joseph Smith, but it was never a sexual relationship, right? He married them. Some of them were older and spinsters than women that Smith had taken on, and now he's taken on to provide for them. But he would have children with 3 of those wives of Joseph Smith that he married. He married Louisa Beeman and had 5 children with her. He married Emily Dow Partridge and ended up having 7 children with her. Are you guys lost in the numbers yet? I can't keep up with it. I'm not even going to try as we move forward to keep up with where we're at, wives and children. I'll give you a list, but I can't keep up with it. And he married Zena Huntington Jacobs, and he ended up having 1 child with her. Perhaps the most significant, though, of Joseph Smith's widows that he married, she'll play very prominently in our story moving forward. He married Eliza Snow, who was, in the Utah years after they got here, the undisputed's not the right word, but the clear leader. She was the leader of all of the women's movements and women's organizations and everything when they got to Utah. Prolific writer. She was known as the poetess of the church. Wrote a lot of hymns and poems and a lot of things in church publications. Their marriage was never a conjugal marriage. It never was between her and Joseph Smith. But he took her in. She would live prominently with him in Lyon's house in Salt Lake after they got to Utah. Was very prominent among his wives, but was a very prominent figure in Mormon history in the years after they got to Utah. So that would be a significant relationship. You put all that together, this is what Brigham's family looked like when they left Nauvoo. This is all the people he was responsible for when they left in 1846. So he had Elizabeth and Violet, his 2 children by his first wife Miriam, who you might remember had passed away. They were 20 and 15. In the parentheses in this list is all how old they were at the time they left Nauvoo. So he had his 2 older children, his first wife, or his second wife, but his first wife now, Marianne Engel, who was 42, with the kids they had together, Joseph, Brigham, Alice, Luna, and John. He had Lucy Ann Decker, who was 23, with her 2 kids, and a child she'd had by Brigham Heber. Harriet Cook, who was 21, Augusta Adams Cobb, who was 43, and her daughter Charlotte from a previous marriage, Clarissa Decker, Clarissa Ross, Emily Partridge, who was 21, and her son Edward, who was 1, Margaret Alley, Louisa Beeman, and Brigham, you got to remember, Brigham's 45. And so he's married to Margaret Alley, who's 20, Louisa Beeman, who's 30, Emmeline Free, who's 19, Margaret, 22, and Zena Jacobs, who was 24. And by my count, which may not be accurate, but my count, that's roughly 25 people that he was responsible for and providing for when they left Nauvoo in the spring of 46. So again, I don't want to hear your whining about your 2, all right? We can figure it out. So polygamy is expanding, and he was committed to that because he had learned it from Joseph, and it didn't matter how much opposition he was going to face, he was committed to doing that. But the big question on his mind and everybody else's mind was, should we even bother to finish the temple? Because this is going to be such a massive project and such a massive expense, and they knew we're probably not going to be able to stay here. We're going to have to leave. So do we go through with this massive project, this massive cost, when we're probably not going to be staying? Brigham was committed to it because he was committed to the endowment and getting that to the people. Not long after they took charge, he had a prayer meeting with Kimball and Newell Whitney, where they got together one night and they did all the sacred washings and anointings and things Smith had taught them. And they prayed together, and Brigham said, I inquired of the Lord whether we should stay here in Nauvoo and finish the temple, and the answer was, we should. And from that moment, every spare dollar and every spare moment was spent trying to finish the temple as quickly as they possibly could, even though they knew they were going to have to abandon it. And we'll talk about next week when they get to the end of that process and what happened instituting the endowment. But they worked night and day. Brigham was there every day supervising in order to get it done as quickly as they possibly could so they could get the endowment out to the people, because that he viewed that as so important. And so one role we kind of see him taking on in this period of time, I think this kind of indicates it, that at a December meeting, John Taylor, who's an apostle, he dedicated a newly composed hymn to Brigham Young. John Taylor would eventually become, as an older man, he would become the third president of the church after Brigham. But who does he look like in that picture? Somebody's got to see it besides me. Doesn't that look like Jeff Daniels? Yeah. Right? All right, I couldn't think it was just me. He composed a hymn. He dedicated it to Brigham Young, but the hymn was entitled The Seer. And the lyrics were all praise Joseph Smith for restoring the priesthood, and picture him pleading for the saints among the gods in heaven. And it's a very long hymn, but I'll just sing you, just kidding. I'm not going to sing it. I'll read you a couple of excerpts. The first verse says, the seer, Joseph the seer. I'll sing of the prophet ever dear, the prophet ever dear. His equal now cannot be found by searching the wide world around. With gods he soared in the realms of day, and men he taught the heavenly way. The fourth verse says, beyond the reach of mobs and strife, he rests unharmed in endless life. His home's in the sky, he dwells with the gods. Far from the furious rage of mobs, far from the furious rage of mobs. He died for those he loved. He reigns in the realms above. Now, if you just pulled that up, you might think that was a hymn about Jesus, wouldn't you? But it was a hymn dedicated to Joseph Smith. There's a couple other early hymns. They're still in the hymn book. This one was removed not that long ago. But Brigham never saw himself in that role. And it's interesting. He realized, I think, he would never be seen as the seer. And that was Joseph. And it doesn't seem like he really had any desire to. And by that I mean, Joseph's reaction to everything was to give a revelation. If there was a problem, you got a direct word from God to fix it. If Emma's giving you a hard time about polygamy, bam, here's your revelation where God's going, Emma, straighten up. And you look at a lot of those early revelations in Doctrine and Covenants, they're dealing with specific problems where Joseph Smith had a revelation, right, saying, right, here's how God says to deal with it. Brigham never did that. And he never really acted that way. There's only one revelation in Doctrine and Covenants from the hand of Brigham Young. Now, he had a lot of visions and he had a lot of dreams and he made a lot of strong commands to people about what God said you should do. But he never did it in the form of a direct revelation from God. What he did do, though, he never really wanted to take on that role like Smith had, which I find it interesting because he was so doggedly loyal to Smith, but he never assumed that kind of same mantle. But he did, in a lot of ways, assume the mantle of becoming the people's high priest. In that, he was bound and determined to go, these endowments and this temple work is so important. And in a lot of ways, that's his legacy, that we will get this to the people, and this will be a key part of our doctrine. And he was bound and determined to do that. So there's a lot going on and a lot crammed into 1845 in those few months. We've talked about it in the past. Part of their difficulty is that Mormon group political action, block voting was a big threat to a lot of people. When you're the largest city in the state, or the second largest, right up there with Chicago, you control a whole lot of votes for the state of Illinois. And a lot of people didn't like that. Group economic controls. So if you lived in Hancock County, where Nauvoo was, and Nauvoo's got 11,000 residents, and then you've got Warsaw and Carthage and these other little towns, and there's a big contract, who do you think is going to get it? Right? You're going to give it, right? The Mormons are going to give it to other Mormons. So there's a lot of economic control there that a lot of people resented. They were building, Nauvoo sits on the banks of the Mississippi. They're building a large port there. A lot of trade going to come and go through there. So that there's economic reasons behind it. Their group religious practices made people very suspicious, right? We don't know exactly what they're doing, but they're weird. Would have been the attitude a lot of people have, and we're guilty of doing the same thing, right? When we don't understand somebody else's practice, rather than try to understand, we just, right, we're scared of it. And a lot of people were just scared because they were doing strange things that were unfamiliar, especially polygamy and immigration. 5,000 of those 11,000 people living in Nauvoo were brand new off the boat immigrants from England, coming in to take good American jobs. And a lot of people didn't like that. So there's a lot of tension, a lot of reasons for the tensions. And even though Joseph Smith was no longer in the picture, and by the way, nobody would ever do a day's time for the murder of Joseph and Hiram Smith. There were some people arrested, and they were all acquitted at trial. Even though Smith was out of the picture, those tensions hadn't gone away. And Tom Ford, the governor of Illinois at the time, publicly pledged to protect the Mormons, but privately told the Mormons, I can't really do anything to help you. In fact, here's what he told them in July of 1844. He said, I'm positively certain I can't raise a militia force in the state who would be willing to fight on your side or hazard their lives to protect you from an attack from your enemies. So on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to you guys. I feel bad for you, but my hands are tied. There's really nothing I can do. On the flip side, he's reported to have said this to an anti-Mormon militia colonel. It's all nonsense. You're going to have to drive these Mormons out yet. And the colonel said, if we do that, Governor, when the time comes, are you going to interfere? And he's reported to have said, no, I will not until you're through. I'm going to turn a blind eye to all of it. So in one sense, politics is politics. And he was being a politician and speaking out of both sides of his mouth, depending on who he was talking to. He wouldn't let the Mormons deploy the Nauvoo Legion to protect themselves from their enemies, because he knew, and he was probably right to do so, right? If they use the Nauvoo Legion, right, to attack their enemies, that's just going to lead to all-out war. And he knew that would lead to Nauvoo just being wiped off the map. So he wouldn't let them do that, and that was probably wise. But his public promises were ultimately just a bunch of governmental bluff and doublespeak. The reality is the Mormons were on their own, and they knew it. And they knew there was bad stuff awaiting them in the future. But Brigham wasn't beyond a little bluster himself. He said this on August 8th, the same speech where they voted to confirm the apostles. He said that if he had been here, he wouldn't have consented to give Joseph up to the law, and he would be damned if he would give himself up to the law of the land, and he would see them all in hell first. And he could talk a big game just as big as anybody else, but he knew that the writing was on the wall in terms of the end, and they were already looking, and I'll go into this detail next week, they were already looking for the next place. And where are we going to go when they force us to leave here? Part of what infuriated the non-Mormons in the area is that Nauvoo had been given such a generous charter by the Illinois legislature that it permitted them to operate its own government, including law enforcement, and its own courts, separate from that of the county, which means it made virtually impossible to convict any Mormon on anything, because any Mormon accused of a crime could get an all-Mormon jury that would acquit him. So there's politics involved there. And so the reality is that 1844 and 1845, even though Smith and Hiram had been killed, there's this growing tension and this growing animosity that's just building all through that year, even as Nauvoo is expanding and growing and turning into this beautiful, not little town, big town for the day and age. It was just a powder keg waiting to go off. And ultimately, what would set the fuse that would ultimately set off that powder keg is in January of 1845, the Illinois legislature revoked the charter of Nauvoo, which essentially left Nauvoo without any police protection or any civil form of government. Young responded defiantly with the same kind of millennial rhetoric we would expect by saying that this nation, the United States, is doomed to destruction as a result of the way they're treating the Mormons. And the nation has severed us from them in every respect and made us a distinct nation just as much as the Lamanites of the Book of Mormon. And he did view the Mormon community that way. And part of the ultimate vision to move to Utah was, he realized, right, we've banged around and banged around. He's already been run out of Kirtland. He's been run out of Missouri. They're being run out of Illinois. He knew we can't go anywhere where there's anybody else around. The same thing is going to happen. We have to get somewhere outside the jurisdiction of the United States, which Utah was in 1846. Utah didn't become a territory until 1848. And so this whole year, 1845, they're looking, they're researching places, they're talking to every fur trapper and person coming back from the west that they could about where are places we could go. Because he did very much view it as, we are going to go start our own independent kingdom, independent of the United States. But it's tied to those millennial expectations too. That we are the restored Israel, we are the true people of God. And it's our calling to build this kingdom that will usher in the return of Christ and Jesus' millennial reign on earth, which was just a continuation of what Joseph Smith had taught. And I think we will leave it there for this week. Next week, we will get through 1845, and we will look at everything that went down that did lead to the fall of Nauvoo and the spring of 1846. How do you get thousands and thousands of Mormons from Nauvoo, Illinois to Ogden, Utah? And it's a fascinating story, and we'll pick it up there next week. Thank you for being here. Have a great week.